Welcome to our conversation today. My name is Kate Charters and I'm the chair of SEGRA, which is the acronym for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. We're delighted to welcome you to the 16th of our conversations about COVID-19 in regional Australia. I'd like to particularly welcome our three panellists today, Megan Dixon from RDA Orana, Craig Perkins and Sue Kilpatrick from RDA Tasmania. So welcome to all of you and thank you very much for participating in today's. I thought, Megan, I'd just ask you to tell us briefly where Orana is and what's the what the area is.
So over my shoulder, you can actually see, so we are basically 25% of inland New South Wales. So our major urban centres are Dubbo and Mudgee, but we go out to the west and we take in the towns of Covert and Burke. And in terms of our region, one of the things that's really interesting for us, I think, is the fact that we have a very solid economic pie in terms of regional business activity, which includes mining, agriculture, which is in recovery from drought, and we have quite a vibrant tourism sector as well, based on things like the Taronga Western Plains Zoo. So we're maybe a little bit fortunate because we do have a fairly robust pie, but that said, we have some significant challenges for our region, whether we're in, disaster recovery or just bubbling along as normal.
Thanks very much, Megan. And of course, we all know where Tasmania is, and we'll hear from Sue and Craig about their particular issues as we progress. We are fully booked for today's teleconference, webinar, which is great, but it does mean that people won't be able to actually ask questions directly of our panelists. But there's a chat box and a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and if you fill in a question or make a comment there, I'll do my best to include that in our conversation. And also at the end of the webinar, we put out a communique that will be available tomorrow afternoon, and we'll do our best to answer questions and make responses there. There's at the top of the chat box that's currently there is the link to the website at SEGRA, where you can find our webinars, and Robert has been keeping a diagram of the key issues as they emerge during our sessions, and there's a link to there as well. But Robert, if I could now turn to you and ask you to present your diagram of where our series of webinars has been going.
Yes, thanks, Kate. I'll try and just get the screen up, and we'll quickly go over where we're at. Isn't it interesting? I think when we started this 6 weeks ago, it was a bit of a fog. There's a big unknown what post-pandemic regional Australia would be. But certainly you can get the sense in the last few weeks we're starting to see glimmers of what it's going to look like or what it should look like, and particularly giving us then clues how we might be coming up with ideas to transition regional Australia into a stronger position. So I think with now and over the next few weeks, we're starting to get, I think, a bit more substance around what this might be. But as we've been building this diagram, again, from right to left over the 15 sessions, that the last Friday, which is one I'll just briefly talk to, where I've just added some of the insights, where we spoke to the representatives from Toowoomba, the Mayor as Chair of Economic Development, and then the Chamber of Commerce and the Tourism CEO. And what came out of, I've pulled out 5 key thoughts that came out of that discussion, which you can, which is more elaborated in the communique. But a common idea was about quickly adapt and reinvent ourselves in regional Australia. It will need to be done very quickly. There was comment about expanding the digital footprint of our presence and businesses, about definitely strengthening local brand awareness, and which is sort of linked a bit about promoting the story, not a sales pitch. And they talked about the 3 C's of connection, collaboration, and collective action. And again, that's probably a pretty good segue into today's session, where I know we're getting closer to talking more specifically about recovery ideas. Back to you, Kate.
Thanks, Robert. That's certainly the idea of this series of conversations that we've initiated, is to assist bringing together the key issues and opportunities while hearing firsthand from people who are actually tackling the impacts of COVID in regional Australia. Most importantly, it's about practical actions, about business, tourism and economic development, setting up for the future. And they're the two headings of the communique that we put out. What are the key issues and what are some of the action agendas that we can take? And so we're delighted that Sue and Craig and Megan have given up their time to give us a window into their particular circumstances. So if I could turn to you firstly, Craig, if you could tell us a bit about the impact of COVID-19 on Tasmania, but more particularly some of the principles that you've been elucidating from the challenges that you've been faced.
Thanks, Kate. So in terms of the impact on Tasmania, certainly I think, and been having listened to my colleagues around Australia on various teleconferences, is that I think that the impact on Tasmania is not dissimilar. Is that, you know, when it first came and businesses were closed, it hit the hospitality and the tourist related businesses and the visitor economy. Things such as construction and advanced manufacturing and agriculture have continued on and have continued on well, which has been very good. But notwithstanding that, there's certainly been a hit around on the discretionary spending and the people employed in those areas. So it's not dissimilar to any other place. And I think around Tasmania, we've seen it have a different kind of impact and different impact on place, particularly where COVID cases have been identified. And if, many people would be aware of the northwest coast of Tasmania had the outbreak around Easter. So what we've seen is, I think, is an impact across, not dissimilar to other places around Australia, and the way people have been responding have been to try and buy local, to buy, you know, particularly from food places, into takeaways and so forth. But there's been obviously, particularly early on, that social distancing and people retreating back out of community somewhat. And in the last few weeks, I think we've seen people starting to come out more and feel more comfortable being around in their community. In terms of the principles, in terms of, you know, what does recovery look like and how does a region organise itself for that? One of the things that we've done, and I think it's worth taking a stock and thinking about what that means in your particular region, not rushing at it too quickly in terms of coming up with all the various ideas and the actions that need to be taken. We've put together what we call a Principles of Recovery document, which you've been able to share on the chat, and it's available through our web page. Is what are some of the things that local communities and local regions probably need to think about in terms of planning what post-COVID might look like from an economic point of view at the forefront, but also how that then flows back into community. So we've put together a number of principles, and they're basically based on the things that we've seen happen as economies fluctuate up and down over the last decade or so, leading, you know, through the global financial crisis and other things, particularly, I guess, as we've seen around Tasmania. The key focus there is about being place-based, and I think the message here is that communities need to take control of and regions need to take control of what their future looks like collectively in a coordinated way. And if you can get those networks and those relationships working well together, it sets up in a much better place for planning for the future. So a place-based approach is the number one key principle. And it's really important that when I think regions think about that, is that what does that mean for other governments? Because generally there's always a call on to levels of government for support, and particularly the Commonwealth. And the further away governments get from the place where the recovery needs to be implemented, the harder it is for specific arrangements to be made. And that's just the nature of the way the governments work, in terms of they'd like to put out a policy that is easily replicable around regions, but the more you do that, the harder it is to necessarily tailor things. So our principles is about communities jumping on the front foot, understanding what it is that's important in their area to start with, and then planning that to be able to give it to government to say that these are the solutions that can help our quickest way to recovery. Now, our principles are based around, say, that place-based approach. Understanding, and we made this our second principle, not that there's a particular order of them, but we name this one as our second one, and that's around wraparound. That's actually understanding that as a result of COVID-19, a lot of people have been impacted, and people have been impacted that normally otherwise wouldn't be, in businesses that have never had hardship before, that have never had to deal with dealing with staff, dealing with unemployment themselves, and actually, as they move into a new environment, what will their business look like, and how do they bring people and themselves along on their journey? So having wraparound support for communities becomes really important, as opposed to not just about investing in infrastructure, if you like, in terms of supporting our community. So place-based approach and wraparound become almost the first two key principles. Then we move on to a number of other ones, and one's about regional coordination, and Sue will talk a bit about this at a bit more length, so I won't touch on that. One's scale and scope, and that's understanding that the solutions for and the opportunities for a local community to recover will be different in scale and scope, and there'll be different projects or programs that can be delivered that they're not always going to be multi-million-dollar ones. Some of them might be just small little activities, and we saw through the Australian Government regional employment trials that a program of $20,000 could make just as much difference as a project of $200,000 in terms of people support. So scale and scope of projects will matter. There will be projects of priority, and I think this is, and from a Tasmanian perspective, these are big, long-term, generational infrastructure projects that can make a big sustainable difference to your economy long-term. And the one that comes to mind from a Tasmanian perspective is what we call Mariners Link, which is actually strengthening the relation to the connection electricity from Tasmania to mainland Australian electricity grid. So renewable energy then can grow behind that and could create a sustainable industry and grow that industry behind it. But that may take, those projects of priority may take 3 or 4 years to deliver, or even to start to deliver. But now's the time to actually start locking in behind them and start planning to make sure that investment actually does happen, and rather than just talk about it's an opportunity. So noticing you've got projects of priority, then we moved on what we call gap building projects, and they are the ones that happen locally. And they might be investment in infrastructure such as sports grounds, community halls, visitor economy kind of investment such as bike trails or the like. So what can happen in the near here and now to keep people working? So if projects of priority come off in 3 or 4 years' time, you've still got a workforce skilled and developed, and you can continue to skill and develop your workforce into those what those future opportunities look like, because you want to keep people in jobs. And now's the opportunity to do that. And importantly for the gap building projects, it's about regions actually identifying what is needed here and now with some evidence behind it, as opposed to heading down the tracks and saying, here's a whole lot of money from levels of government, go and build something that may not necessarily be what your community needs right now. And rightly or wrongly, the good example I use often is the global financial crisis, where there's money's put into all the schools, which, you know, in hindsight, you might have gone, well, actually, that money might not be better spent on that school in that community, but something else to keep that community going, which actually might be in another town that they might use. So if communities and regions can think through what are those number one priorities, and that provides the response to government and say, design your programs to allow that to happen, because that's going to have a legacy impact on our community. Thinking about productive capacity becomes important. The economy is obviously taking a hit, and it's going to take a hit for a while. So again, it's about setting up projects that can actually have an impact on building the productive capacity of your regions. And some of that stuff might be placemaking, which is about population attraction, obviously big change in skills and migration and the migratory workforce. So can we continue to invest in place to make it a place that people will want to be in regional Australia? We know that Infrastructure Australia has done work to show that the further you get out of the capital cities, the less attractive places, because investment isn't done in infrastructure. So so productive infrastructure can be about placemaking as well. Local decision making becomes really important. I think this links back to the local regional coordination and collaboration that Sue will talk about, but making sure that local people are involved in decision making in a constructive framework, and not just coming up with lots of brainstorming ideas and just putting things forward, making sure it's a coordinated approach. Another one, which I think is really important, is timing and flexibility. I think local councils will be called upon to deliver a lot going forward in terms of infrastructure spend to keep people engaged. Local councils have taken a huge hit a lot from a Tasmanian perspective. They've, remove fees, remove rate increases, putting out other money to support community events in recovery and other things. What does that mean? It means actually that that they actually potentially won't have the resource capacity to actually start investing in things that they otherwise would have liked to have, because they actually won't have the resource. So, but some will be better placed than others. So having timing and flexibility around what the response might look like becomes important. So rather than saying, here's $1 million for infrastructure spend, you've got 12 months to do it, say to the local council, how long will it take you to spend it? And if it takes them 3 years to do something, and to do something that's relevant for their area, that's okay, because the council next door might be in a better position and to do something a bit quicker. And the other one too is that we know there was a shortage of workforce in construction and other things around Australia. It was occurring in Tasmania before this came, so that's not necessarily going to change if there's money been spent into infrastructure again to get people working. So understanding what the workforce and workforce planning and pipeline of projects and matching responses to that becomes important. So that's the guiding principles. They're not a government principle. They're not set in anywhere, but I would be saying to regions, take something like this and say, this is the way we want it to work for ourselves, because this is how we know it'll help us best recover, and put the onus back on to those that might provide support, particularly at the government level, to work with you, as opposed to determining how recovery expenditure should happen.
Craig, could I just follow up on that point at a project level? Because I think it's really good you're starting to separate the discussion of nation-building infrastructure, which really has nothing to do with COVID, but we need to do it, and actually post-COVID recovery projects, which have to be faster, and we don't want to confuse the two. But also that other point about, do you think we can think that differently? Because, you've said the sectors hit this time are very, very different to ever been hit before. And I wonder, are we going to fall in the trap of just rethinking recovery projects that might funnel construction skills or others, which is traditional thinking? But the sectors we're hitting, accommodation, arts, these are sectors we haven't had ideas about for recovery before. Do you think that's a little bit of a sleeper there when you're working through your projects?
I think so. And, I think you think a project can be three things. It can be a project. It can be a program to deliver the wraparound support, or it could be investment in cultural activities to get people out socialising again in whatever way we will be able to do that, noticing that we don't know what that will look like. And some of it might actually be around government policy change, just to make it easier for some things to happen, notwithstanding we have to manage the health risks along the way. So I think it's just investing everything in the nation, but that will need to continue, obviously, and possibly in different ways, because our movement of people is going to change for a while. So maybe again, what becomes a priority right now might be able to move them around. I think at a nation building level, people like Infrastructure Australia will know exactly that thought. But at the local level, it's what's the difference? And I think from a tourism and visitor economy is in Tasmania. We hear that, if every visitor, every business that was been supported by the visitor economy, was involved in the visitor economy, opened up today, the intrastate Tasmanian market could only support 30% of that industry. So it relies heavily on domestic, out of Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland, markets, and if you haven't got people moving, then just investing in things to get those businesses open again isn't necessarily going to work. So, but what the question is to that sector is to think about what can work to get some of them open and to get people involved again. And I think the industries need to, the sector in that instance probably needs to give that some thinking of themselves as well.
You're muted, Kate.
Thanks, Craig. And it's been interesting during this period of time that we've been running the seminars. One of the things that's come up quite a few times is that ideas are good, but solutions are even better, and looking at what those solutions are. And some of our panelists have been talking about a solution platform, a mechanism for testing solutions, and I found that quite refreshing, and a shift in the conversation. Sue, can I turn to you now? And we've heard the overview from Craig. How's that actually applying on the ground?
Yeah, well, I think this is the biggest challenge. So Craig's talked about place-based and local, and how important it is to have local input into decision making. But we're also very aware that the default position is often that people in regions all have different ideas, and they all have their own channels up to politicians and so on. And that what you end up with is not a single regional voice that we need most from our region. It's a mixed voice. So I see one of the biggest challenges for effective COVID recovery is to get some kind of a coordinated regional response where people in the region really come to understand what the region needs and how to go about it. And this is a bit of a black box, you know, how do you make that happen? So Craig and his team have been having regular catch-ups with some of the key players in other levels of government. Tasmania has an RDA committee for the whole state. We also have a state government for the whole state. So working with our state government is important. But in terms of how the economy really, really works, Tasmania really has 3 sub-regions. So when I think about post-COVID recovery, I'm really thinking about 3 regions working out what they want and then coordinating that with the state and federal governments. So I want to talk a little bit about the particular experience in Northern Tasmania, because as well as my RDA role, I'm also interim chair of our local Northern Tasmanian Development Corporation. And we've been working with the RDA for a while on what we've called a regional collaboration framework, which is really just a kind of a way of saying, well, we actually get together and decide what the regional priorities are. And post-COVID recovery is a really good case for us to take on, and something that everybody sees needs to happen. So how do we actually go about this? So a lot of it's kind of talking around. So our CEO, I think Mark is listening in here, is talking to lots of different groups independently, but also together. So we're not just talking with the commercial sector, we're talking with the social enterprise sector, the not-for-profits, and then socialising ideas at different points. We were on the SEGRA webinar, as a SEGRA conference back, I think it was about 2011 in Geelong. Kate, was that 2011?
Yes, probably.
Simon Crean came along and he said, look, when as government we give money to Geelong, we know everybody will be happy because Geelong knows what it wants. If we give money everywhere else, then some people will be happy and some won't. So we know that we get good value money from Geelong, and that's because Geelong, certainly then, and I think now, can talk amongst itself. And even if they don't always agree internally, they can present some kind of united front. So that's the aim. So it's looking at the process. It's looking at talking around, shopping the ideas that different people have around. There's a survey that's gone out at the moment around the region to ask for ideas of what might be recovery projects. But there are criteria about what they might be. And as Craig said, some things will be kind of shovel ready. One of the things that in the state we are looking at mining is the projects that have been put up for various government schemes that haven't quite got a Guernsey in the scheme, partly because there hasn't been enough money. So some of the regional development project money, even possibly some of the NDIS projects that were ready to go still have merit. So that's one source. So that's at the opposite end, the nation building Project Marinus kinds of projects. So we're really mindful though that the projects have to fit the principles of recovery that Craig said, but also to be agreement around a pipeline, and that we need to socialise what we're talking about around the region. So we have So there's a communication, for want of a better word, strategy that needs to accompany the agreement around regional priorities, so that people understand what the region's strengths are. They also understand things like not having too many construction projects, because all you end up with is bidding up the cost of the resources for the construction and getting less, whatever they are. We notice that already the federal government has said, look, we want to local government, what are your road priorities? We want to give you money for your road priorities. Well, this is all very well. So one of our local councils said, look, we put $16 million worth of priorities up. Well, that's nice. But how are they all really regional priorities, all of those 16 million? And how do we spread them amongst our regions? So we've started to talk locally about construction projects and how they might perhaps be distributed so that they meet regional needs, and we don't just get less bridges for the same money that if we staged our bridges, we could have got more bridges. So socialisation is very important. Craig talked about wraparound. Tasmania has a relatively low level of educational attainment, plenty of opportunity for skill building, and it's really a time to be thinking about skill building projects. Craig mentioned renewable energy, which some of the proposals there are quite a way off. So now's the time to start thinking about what do we need in the way of engineers, what do we need in the way of various trades that are trying to work on renewable energy that take some time to train. So skill building projects need to fit with both the short and long term as far as COVID recovery comes about. But what I really can't stress enough is the need for funding to be flexible, but also the need for regions to be ready to work together through the priorities and be confident that what they come up with is staged. So there are things straight away, and some of those might be community wellbeing projects. Was involved in evaluating a really great initiative on King Island recently that was based around positive psychology. So there are projects like that. There are things in the traditional sectors, the health sectors, the aged care, disability sectors. But then there are things, we talked about Tasmania's reliance on the visitor economy. A lot of our visitor economy can be thought about as a way of marketing or advertising our food and beverages and food and produce. Now, having people come and visit and sample is our number one. That's where we'd like to get back to. But what can we do in the interim that will advertise our food and beverages in different ways so that we can start people working again in those sectors? So that kind of project is the sort of thing that we might be looking for. There are roles for leaders, but this, in my view, this isn't the time for up there and say follow me type leaders. It's the time for enabling leaders that work collaboratively and can work flexibly across regions, so that there's general agreement about this is what will work for a region. I might stop there and see if anyone has any questions or comments or whatever.
So just a quick one about the single voice, which makes a lot of sense. Is there anything that with post-COVID that you think's different to that challenge, or is it just the same as a normal challenge of networking?
Well, I think the post-COVID environment actually concentrates the mind and concentrates the minds. I've seen people who normally don't work together say, well, actually, we'll put that aside. So within our region, some of the perhaps bigger personalities, I did hear one of them say, well, we didn't actually work with the local government, but actually we have because of COVID, and I'm actually really delighted, and I was actually really delighted too to hear that. So some of those adversarial relationships, the barriers are broken down. So I see this as a fantastic opportunity. In the Launceston, we've had a city deal. We were one of the first 3 city deals. So we've had a little bit of practice at working together. I think we've learned a little bit about how to work together and perhaps how not to. But this is really an opportunity to put aside some of those perhaps those egos and differences. So yeah, I'm hoping that big things will come out from this in the longer term. It's not easy. I acknowledge that, but it's worth giving collaborative decision making and prioritisation a red hot go, in my opinion.
Yes, and I think one of the things that you've highlighted there, perhaps subliminally, is the importance of shared values.
Absolutely, yes, shared values, but it's more than shared values. It's also a shared understanding of regional strengths. Whilst most of the regional leaders have that shared understanding, in the Tasmanian community, Tasmania's older populations and people with more perhaps conservative values, although we do have the strong green movement that sort of counterbalances that. But there are pockets of why do we need development, I like it just the way it used to be, and lack of an understanding that it wasn't going to be the way it used to be anyway, and it definitely won't be now. So it's how do you bring those people along, and how do you, which saves the energy and effort of battling with them when you get to planning schemes and, you know, the height of a building or something like that. If there's some understanding about that, things have to change. So that whole socialisation, not easy, and you don't want everybody being the same. The world would be awfully boring, you know. Economies work through innovation and diversity and different ideas and debate. So I don't see utopia as total agreement, but shared values certainly help getting an understanding of a shared understanding of the direction you want to go in, Kate.
Thanks very much, Sue. Now, I'm keen to bring Megan into the conversation. I'm aware we've got some comments in the chat box, which I'll try to get to. But if I could come to you, Megan, if you could tell us a little bit more about what is happening in Orana in terms of post-COVID recovery.
Yeah, so I think the conversation has actually been really interesting, but I think one of the things, I guess, from our perspective, we're a little bit more sector focused, and one of the key challenges for us in our region, and we've been banging the drum on this quite a while, is that as an inland area, we do struggle with workforce and regional population growth. So our two urban centres of Dubbo and Mudgee do okay, and we have a struggle with our little rural communities, and that was evidenced by the December 19 labour stats, where our actual regional unemployment was 1.9%, which is the lowest it's been in a long time. And I had to look at the figures because it was a real anomaly to me in terms of the dip in unemployment figure. And one of the things for us around regional recovery, and you know, I've looked at the numbers and I've looked at the job losses, and we're definitely buffered by some of the recovery mechanisms that are being implemented by the Commonwealth. You know, the JobKeeper allowance will soften the impact without a doubt in terms of keeping money within the local economy, etc. But one of the things that I think about, and we know that, you know, governments tend to react to this sort of thing in disaster by giving money to spend on construction, but they're short-term stopgaps and don't necessarily address the problem in an area like ours where we actually have a critically short workforce. So what we see is people come in, take advantage of those construction projects and then nick off. And, you know, a classic example for us, and we are actually a renewable energy zone for New South Wales, but a lot of that construction is actually imported. So the goods that, you know, go into those renewable energy things are actually imported from Germany and overseas. And a lot of the labour comes out of South Australia that has that renewable energy expertise. And the challenge for us is actually converting that into something more meaningful. But from a sector base, the challenge for us is that in recovery, we still have a labour issue. So one of the challenges for government is to actually, and I think about this in terms of the history of how Australia's developed. You know, people used to follow the booms. We don't do that anymore. And you know, well-known demographers talk about the fact that Australians are way less willing to shift now. So they're embedded in the major centres of Sydney and Melbourne. and they're way less likely to actually go where the jobs are. And that's one of the fundamental changes that I still think needs some consideration in this post-COVID-19 conversation, in terms of how do we actually encourage some of the great unemployed that we're going to see in Sydney and Melbourne and the capital areas to actually come out into the regions where the job opportunities are. So for us, that's something that we will continue to bang the job on, and I think critically important. I think one of the other things is, I guess, that whole notion of a regional collaboration framework. And I don't think that regional Australia can speak with a singular voice. And one of the things that we've started to talk about is that, and one of the issues for us as an inland area is that we get lumped into the coastal areas, and the coastal areas have very different challenges to an inland area, which is a production powerhouse. So we have the jobs, but we don't have the people. The coastal areas have the people, but don't have the jobs. And so I actually do think that we need to start being a little bit more intellectual, I guess, in terms of how we think about regional Australia. And it's one of the things that I think, the federal government has recognised by establishing the regional development committees. It does recognise that regional areas are different, and that, there needs to be some regionalisation in that. But I think that we also probably do need to start separating some of the policy out in terms of what works for a coastal area is not necessarily going to work for an inland area, because we do have very different problems.
Thanks very much, Megan. I've just turned now to a couple of the questions that we have. One's very specific and one's very big, but I'll go with the specific one first, and anyone on the panel is welcome to answer this. It's from Debbie saying, I'm getting lots of questions from businesses about how to practically deal with businesses in socially distant, disinfected world. There is a lack of clarity about what's required at the grassroots level, and business is nervous about compliance and exposure to risk. Very much an on-the-ground problem. Have people had experience with that in your regions?
Yeah, so listen, for us, one of the things with us is that we are a very dispersed region, 25% of the state. And one of the roles that we've fulfilled as an RDA is definitely trying to coordinate and pull information together for business and be that funnel of information. And we've seen, and we've just completed a survey, which we've had a terrific response to, and there's a huge the businesses around the information that's coming out, and they don't always understand it either. The Safe Work Australia information is actually extremely well presented, and we've been really pushing that hard with businesses. I think the challenge for businesses is that they still have to look at that information and go, how does this work for my business? And that's where there's maybe a little bit of a gap in terms of that there clearly isn't enough business advisors around the country in terms of actually helping business interpret some of that information and go, this will work for me, this won't. We've looked at the information ourselves in terms of, what will work for us, and we've had to make some changes for us to actually return to the workplace in terms of some of the things that are actually recommended on there. So, but that toolkit, I think, is a really good starting point in terms of what WorkSafe Australia have presented for business, and everybody should be promoting it.
Thanks. There's an additional question come through for you, Megan, which is, I agree with the fact that no single solution can address the specifics of a region, but do you think that there's a process that we could all agree to?
I think there's some fundamentals that are really important, but for each region, we've each got our own problems. And I think as somebody who's worked in economic development for a very long time, those fundamentals don't change, and they underpin the work that you do. And I think that, that some of the fundamentals that Craig talked about actually go towards that. Things like And I think where Robert was talking about, you know, one of the biggest fundamentals is that connection and collaboration and the working together, and putting aside the fiefdoms and the parochialness when you're working within a region is really important. I think one of the things that we often also forget is that regional leaders sometimes aren't the people who are actually vocal. It's the quiet people that go about and do stuff, and sometimes you've actually got to find them and pull them into the fold in terms of that regional leadership, because they're the doers. They're the ones that are actually out there doing and leading by doing rather than leading by shouting. So, and that's, I think, for us, our engagement with the business community is way more important than our engagement with local government, to some degree, as an example. So because it is the business community that will pull us out of this. It's not going to be local government or government. So they're the stopgap in terms of what they do, but it's actually business that will make the difference to recovery.
Thanks. Now we have a question for you, Sue, from Anthony. Sue, loving the insights you're offering here. Can you tell us, please, what the high-level vision is for regions beyond survival? What is the place of the region in Australia? Do we now have a new place in the nation's identity, or are we destined to decline, as Jim Covert suggested in an earlier seminar? So, Sue,
I listened to I listened to Jim say that, and I thought, here he is sitting in northwest Tasmania, and here I am sitting in, you know, down the road a couple of 100 kilometres. I'm not quite sure I agree with that. Megan's talked about the productive powerhouse of the regions. I mean, you can go back in time. The person who was the original Cradle Coast Authority, so the Northwest Tasmanian chair, once said to me, what was it that when did Australia stop being the land of the region and the countryside, and the tide turn, and now we're the land of the cities? But still the productive capacity is largely there in regional Australia. So should there be a vision for the regions? If I can just pause, hold that for a moment, and come back down to Tasmania. Craig mentioned populations, one of our challenges, and I think Megan's also mentioned population, so getting people with skills in the regions. And so we've been saying, well, actually, you know, we've got in a lot of our cities, we've got pretty good broadband. People will be used to these low commute times, you know, from your bedroom, how many steps is it to your living room where you do your work. If you move to regional Australia, there's a good chance you might have to walk a few more steps than that, but you'll be able to hang on to that extra personal time. So what can we do now to take advantage of people's increased desire to be home and near home, changing expectations, and meet some of these skill needs? So in my view, this is a time when regions should be recruiting populations. It's a time when regions should be thinking about, Craig mentioned placemaking projects. How do you make your region more livable and more attractive? We shouldn't be expecting all our young people to take off and go to the cities. What can we do to, even if they go when they're young, what can we do to attract them back when they get to that family formation stage, when they realise that regions are a good place to live? Now, back to Anthony's question about regions in the national identity. So we don't ride on the sheep's back anymore, but we're still a wide brown land. You only have to listen to the national anthem. I think it is a time to really start a conversation about where do we live, how do we live, and where do we live, and what are the options. RDA Tasmania had a population symposium. When was that, Craig? May last year, was it that long ago? Something like that, about a year ago. And we had some people who'd moved to Tasmania from mostly Sydney talk to us about how you could live in a Georgian house in Longford, 10 minutes from the airport, and be at a meeting anywhere in Eastern Australia by 9:30 a.m, which you couldn't do if you lived in suburban Sydney necessarily. And other people talking about how you could use digital connectivity to stay in contact with your clients. And I think if we have learnt something from COVID-19, we've learnt that we can Zoom that we can meet virtually online. So now's the time that the region should be taking advantage of that change in attitude and that new learning. So I really don't think that regional Australia is dead. I've built my career to a large extent on the idea of rural regions and how they can work better together. I think it's a time that regional Australia should be standing up and saying, you know, hey, what do we need to keep us thriving? We need better, more widespread, better broadband is pretty clear. I think that's one thing that has come out of this. But I think we need to maintain the vision of Australia as a diverse place with lots of places, each of which has different needs, and which plays right back into that need for flexible COVID recovery projects that we started talking about.
Thanks very much, Sue. I regret to say that time is up. It goes so quickly. But thank you all very much for participating. And I just give each of you an opportunity for a closing remark, starting with Megan. You're on mute, Megan.
Yes, sorry about that. I think it's, I honestly, and I believe that it is time for regions to actually, and maybe there's an opportunity for regions to be coming together to actually change that narrative. You know, it's the most common thing that we hear in terms of that it's the narrative and the understanding of what regional living is about. And now there's probably never been a better time in terms of actually talking about what a regional lifestyle can actually offer, be living in the city, particularly in, you know, while we've been in lockdown. I mean, out here you still have a backyard, and you know, it's actually, you know, the nature walk that is, you know, a block away from me is pretty magnificent on the river. So so in terms of what living in regional Australia has to offer, it is, I think, time for us to, that is something that we can come together on in terms of starting to tell that story. And I think that the idea of actually reinventing, there's a notion that we actually do need to reinvent that story of how we are the production powerhouse, and there are plenty of opportunities in regional Australia in recovery. Thanks very much, Megan. Craig.
Thanks, Kate. I wrote a couple of things on a bit of paper before we started, and one was each region has similarities but is different. Basically, regions are the same but different, and I think that's the point, is that and another thing I wrote was understand and articulate your core fundamentals of your local economy, and I don't think they change. I think, as Megan's talked about, not changing there. They're certainly not changing. I like to hope in Tasmania. What you're seeing is changing economic activity around those fundamentals. But certainly there are certain things that are continuing on. So it's building on your strengths and that base, but understanding what that's about, and then being able to articulate as a collective voice of leadership. And just again, picking up some of the earlier comments, is often people look for a leader in your community. My argument when we're working around building this regional collaboration framework was keeping it simple and understanding that there are many leaders. What you want is that all those leaders having the same message to sell. And some of them are quiet leaders and some of them are strong and vocal. But if you're actually all committed and wedded to a similar message, then the regional leadership comes from the collective. But you have to understand the core fundamentals and the way that your region operates and works, and where those opportunities are, and things like connectivity, either physically through airports and other things, noting there's not many planes in the sky at the moment, or through IT connectivity, become critical. And now's the time to probably enhance that. Just one little quick example, and then I'll pass over, is that northwest Tasmania has probably the most productive dairy land in Australia due to the rain and where it's located. The biggest dairy company in Australia. One of the challenges there is for their multiple farms that they operate is that they don't have access to very good IT connectivity, either broadband or mobile phone. And in fact, some of the farms would have to drive into the local centre, Smithton, to update their payroll for their staff because they couldn't do it on farm. So there's a business impact there, but there's also this: how do I attract people that want to go and be farmers and dairy farms that have young people, that's the students want to learn online, be activity and want to be just like any other young person and teenager, and you want them to be so they become smart on technology and connected. How do you attract those people? And that's that livability exercise. So I think if one thing that's come from this is actually saying, you can actually find out where some of your, you know where your strengths are, how do you play and build on them, and where are those little weakest links in the chain that can be overcome and dealt with by focusing some investment around that and some energy. So right now, I think is take time, have a look about what your region needs, and be the collective voice, and don't wait for others to come and try and solve your problems.
Thanks very much. And Sue, some closing remarks? Very
quickly, I see Anthony's asked another question, and it's about if you're going to attract new people into a region, how do you be welcoming? And that's a really pertinent remark. I don't know if everyone can see the chat, but if you want population, it's not just about things, it's about making sure that there are social mechanisms that connect people. And there's a welcoming region program that the Regional Australia Institute's put out. The Northern Tasmanian Economic Development Corporation has adapted that. And if you look on the website, which I'll put up in the chat box in a minute, it's an example of the kinds of things that you can do. But it includes connecting young professionals to other young professionals. So it's part of the wraparound support that Craig talked about. So when you think regional recovery, it's a good opportunity to think beyond bricks and mortar is the message that I would like to leave everyone with.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our panellists. It's been, as always, a great discussion. There'll be a communique up with the key issues and action agendas tomorrow afternoon. We also have our latest news section on the SEGRA website under the general button, where we put together some useful websites. If people would like to contact me, my email is kate@segra.com.au and Robert is at robert@vitalplaces.com.au. Next week, we'll be hearing from Rod Hillman. Next Friday, we'll be hearing from Rod Hillman, the Chair of Ecotourism Australia, and Angus Robinson from Leisure Solutions, who's deeply steeped in geotourism and it's got some wonderful ideas around that. So look forward to hearing from you later in the week, and thanks again very much.